Okay, so now I want to say thank you. You are our community of members and our supporters. And these lectures were started in the early days of the Arboretum by Dr. J.C. Ralston. And I chuckled. I went back and looked at some of the newsletters, and I had to chuckle because if you look at the first couple of newsletters when he announced these lectures, some of the ways he advertised them were, "This is the only notice you'll receive." Or there was always the frequent, "A slideshow will be presented." And I remember when I was in school, I'll date myself, I remember the mini carousels of slides that he would bring to class. So, and then the other thing that was a constant in these announcements was bring a friend. And that is what I want to talk about because you have done that. You have brought friends. Our membership, I asked Catherine, I don't know if Catherine's in the room, but I asked Catherine what our membership is. To date, we have 2,790 households, but that equates to 4,426 members. That is amazing. And in that first newsletter that JC wrote, he said he was celebrating the Friends of the Arboretum program the membership program had been in effect for like 6 months, and he had reached 50 members. And he was very excited about that. And he said in the newsletter, he's like wondering when he would hit 1,000. Would it be in 1983? Would it be in 87? Would it be in 1990? So, JC, we have fully extended the 1,000. And we're at the 4,426. That's just amazing. So thank you for bringing a friend, either tonight to this program, to the gardens, to your gardens, to one of our events, to sharing our plants with them, or just telling them stories about the Arboretum. And here at the Arboretum, we want to be known as a community based on sharing. We want to share our knowledge. We want to share our passion. We want to share our plants. And also, we want to share our friends. So with that in mind, tonight we are sharing one of our dear friends, Diane Flynt, with you. And I hope that you will really enjoy this. I have enjoyed getting to know Diane, just talking with her back and forth on Zoom. And I think this is going to be a lot of fun. Diane's roots started in a small town in Georgia, where her father shared his passion for the natural world with her. Her path continued through North Carolina and the corporate world of banking. But Diane dreamed of farming, and it called her out of the corporate world. And she calls it her second story. And she shares about the journey establishing an apple orchard and also making cider in her new book, Wild, Tamed, Lost, Revived, the surprising story of apples in the South. Diane is going to share about her journey and research for this book with us tonight. And then we're excited to also have the opportunity to chat with Diane and two people from her apple community, Anne Marie Thornton of James Creek Cider House, and also David Vernon of Century Farm Orchards back there in the back. They're going to come up in the front after Diane finishes and have a little conversation with us. And when you just can't get enough apples, we're going to have time to taste some cider. We've got some tasty treats back there to go along with the cider. Diane will be back with Quail Ridge in the back with her book if you'd like for her to sign one for you, and you can take it home and read all about her journey. And then there's also time to chat and just catch up with this wonderful community of our friends. So thank you for being here, and I'm going to go into the back where I'm more comfortable and let Diane
Elizabeth, thank you for that lovely introduction and welcome. That was, I kind of got goosebumps and got a little teary-eyed hearing about the growth of the Arboretum. I'm just happy to have the opportunity to be in a room full of plant people. I know here at the Arboretum, you're interested in learning and growing. You want to explore the natural world. You want to build your connection to plants, bring beauty into your life. And I think we have something in common there. And I also know I won't have to explain pollination to you. So I'm very pleased with that. That's always the first thing I do in a talk. I like to begin with place because this is such a special place. And Elizabeth really highlighted that. And it really did give me goosebumps. Patsy and I were involved with JC and on the board. And he and this place have been extremely influential in my own gardening and farming journey. So I know this place and you are involved in a community of creativity and growing. And I believe the place that my husband Chuck and I occupy in the world in Southwest Virginia, just north of Mount Airy, about 45 minutes north of Mount Airy, we're up on something called the Blue Ridge Plateau at 3,000 feet elevation. So our place is very different in terms of climate. And also scenery, because if you visited us right now, you would see a lot of cabbage. Carroll County, Virginia grows more cabbage than any other county in the country. but it wasn't the cabbage that called to me, it was the apples. And Ronnie Lundy, the cookbook author, calls this Appalachia. And our part of Virginia is very rural. This is a view over our farm. Toward Buffalo Mountain, our nearest, can I get a light up here on the podium? Possibly. Yeah, okay. So we're about 25 miles from a bad grocery store. So it's nothing like the traffic you have out there. We are in a very rural setting and surrounded by apple trees this time of year. Seedling trees, out in the middle of a pasture. This is a view from the Blue Ridge Parkway. This is probably a grafted tree that a farmer has protected from cattle, an old tree for that family. And, family apples hanging over barns. This is right around the corner from us. Apples are everywhere. And what you might not know is that once, thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much. That once apples were not just in the mountain South, they were everywhere in the South. And I want to take you on a little bit of a journey in the next few minutes and talk about the surprising story of apples all over the South. And take a look at this map. Some of the most important centers of apple growing in the South in the 19th century were Greenwood, Mississippi, Columbia, South Carolina, Augusta, Georgia. South Alabama is home to a very famous apple that was exported to England. And this is not what people think of when they think of apples in the South. So this journey we're going to go on for the next few minutes is a journey of a region led by an unexpected ingredient, an ingredient that most people don't even associate with the South. So apples captured me because they are so intimately connected to people. And to explain that, I need to talk about sex. So, and I don't need to go into it quite as much as I would with a non-plant audience. But just as an example here, this is a Fruitland's nursery catalog. This was the most prominent nursery in apple tree nursery, and they also sold ornamentals and outside of Augusta, Georgia. And this is their 1861 catalog. These are just their premier apples. This catalog listed 400 apples and I think 1,000 pear trees. The 400 apples were not all originated in the South, but many were. And the catalog trumpeted the apples that were from Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, Central Georgia, and asserted that apples, southern apples, grow best in the South. Some of these apples are extinct now. Many are hard to find. Many you find only at specialty nurseries like David Vernon's excellent nursery outside of Reidsville. You'll learn more about that later. But these apples all came about because Southerners selected apples. Individual Southerners decided that this fruit had some use for them. And it's that story that brings people and apples together. the apples in the South looked a lot different than the 4 or 5 you see in the grocery store. This is a lineup of the fruit from my own orchard, and you'll see a similar range of size and shape on the back table. You've got the little Hughes crab apple over there in the corner closest to me, and the big horse apple on the other end. So apples captured me because they have this diversity and because they're so tied to humans. And the apples started in the South as seedling trees. And let me talk a little bit about sex and apples and pollination. When the beautiful pink blooms, and this is a stage of apples bud development, fruit development that we call pink. And don't you love that name? It's so evocative of what an orchard looks like in the spring. The bees and other insects pollinate the apple. You have petal fall and then fruit set. And inside that tiny little apple are the beginnings of the seed, which are the offspring of the apple. So apples are heterozygous like humans, so it's sexual propagation. So each of those seeds is a combination of the DNA of 2 parents. So if you go to the grocery store and you love Honeycrisp and you eat a Honeycrisp and you cut it around the equator and you look at it and you look at the seed pockets called carpels, and inside each one are usually 2 seeds, probably about 10 seeds in that apple. If you planted those 10 seeds, you would get 10 apple trees, but you would not get a Honeycrisp because each seed is the combination of the DNA of that propagation. It's just like a brand new human being to the world. All of these early southern orchards were primarily seedling orchards. So it was like one giant experiment station, our whole region of the South. And Southerners chose from among that great genetic diversity, they chose apples. All the ones listed on that nursery catalog I just showed you chose apples because they had a desire for a particular apple. That's what unites humans and apples. Every named apple in the world is around because a human noticed it, paid attention to the world around them like you pay attention to your landscape and your garden, and made a choice. And it's that story and the history behind those choices that animates my book, that is the center of my book. So let me tell you a little bit about some of those choices. Southerners began naming their apples, and one of the first Southerners to plant a really large orchard is a fellow who immigrated from England to the northern neck of Virginia, William Fitzhugh. The northern neck is that sandy spit that curls around the top of Virginia. And he planted some of the largest apples in the colonial South. Immigrated in the, in the 1680, and he planted tobacco, of course, because that was the currency of the time, but he also, every farm he owned, he planted apple trees, thousands and thousands of apple trees. He had one orchard that had 1,200 trees, and it was actually fenced with a locust fence that he said was as strong as brick walls. And when I say William Fitzhugh planted apples, he, of course, did not plant apples. The indentured servants he brought with him, and then later the enslaved men and women on his plantation planted these trees. So what did an orchard look like in the 17th century? Imagine Virginia covered in virgin forest, hickory, oak, chinkapin, cypress trees 18 feet in diameter that were used for masts on ships. So the enslaved men and women cut those with axes and mattocks. They sawed the wood into staves. William Fitzhugh had a barrel stave business because why did he need barrels? Well, he was fermenting cider and shipping apples. And they planted apple trees, seedling apple trees, in and among those giant stumps. So it was this higgledy-piggledy orchard, nothing like we have today with straight rows. But we were getting so much genetic diversity then. The first orchard in America is often said to be a Reverend Blackstone orchard in Massachusetts, but the first recorded planted orchard was in Jamestown, Virginia in 1615. People have accused me of writing the apple version of My Big Fat Greek Wedding because I hope to explode many myths about apples. And the first named apple was not Roxbury russet from Massachusetts. It was probably the Virginia white apple, selected by a Southerner because it was great for cider. Apples in the colonial South were ubiquitous. Cider was used for currency. There was no currency. They used tobacco and cider instead of money. Apples were exported to the Caribbean. They were part of the slave trade. The colonies sent apples and cider to the Caribbean, and rum and human beings came back. So you begin to see, even at this early stage, the entwining of this fruit with the history of our region, with a very complex history. By the 1750s, Southerners were taming their apples, and by that I mean they were choosing them and naming them. And as early as the 1750s, nurseries from Virginia all through the South were already selling Southern apples and touting them as ideal for the region. Some of the names that you'll see in those early nursery catalogs are Virginia White, Hughes Crab, which you can see and taste today, Tolliver, which is a famous cider apple that sadly is extinct, Rawls Janet, which David and I think Anne-Marie, you probably grow Rawls Janet as well, very old Virginia apple and a late season apple, so we don't have it for you today. And a story that I think tells the tale of taming is that it was 1850, there was 1815, there was no USDA, and the way that farmers exchanged information was like book clubs. They had like agricultural book clubs, and they swapped information. And there was a really famous one in Central Virginia called the Fruit Tree Association. It had, I think, 3 presidents and a bunch of farming dignitaries. And they ordered $1,000 worth of fruit trees from the Prince Nursery in Long Island. That was the most prominent nursery in America. So they ordered 58 fruit trees, $1,000, and they ordered no apples because by then the South already had its apples. So the way you tame an apple, so how do you replicate? I talked about reproduction earlier, sexual reproduction. So how do you replicate an apple? How do we end up with so many Granny Smiths? And how do we have Hughes Crab today when it was an apple selected in the late 1600s? Well, you do that by tissue propagation. Humans have known how to graft for 2,000 years. You can graft in lots of ways. You can use dormant wood, and that's probably the most common throughout history. You can bud graft. You can graft in other ways in labs that the geneticists use. But that gives you a tree that is identical. It is a clone of the tree that you graft. So every named apple has been grafted. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around. It is a great illustration of the connection between apples and people. And that connection is shown, I think, in a story about a grower in Nelson County. So I'm taking you now to the middle of the 19th century. The Department of Agriculture has been formed, and even a pomology division in 1856 is formed. And there are fruits and nut trees all over the country. They all have like 20 names, different names for the same apple. And so they start a division to record these apples in botanical illustrations, very detailed botanical illustrations. So for 40 years, the USDA employed botanical illustrators, many of them women, to capture apples. And these are pictures of, as you know, you probably know a lot about botanical illustration. This is not not a Rawls Janet. It is that particular Rawls Janet that was mailed in. So actually the pomologists today go into these files, and you can access them online from the USDA Pomological Watercolor Collection. There are thousands and thousands of these beautiful paintings. And they actually go in today and study disease, apple disease, by looking at these beautiful paintings. And this story, this is a grower from Nelson County, Virginia, who in the late 1800s had 6 apples that were dear to him, that he grew on his farm. That farm still exists in the same family. And he shipped these 6 apples to Washington, D.C., to have them recorded by the USDA and made into botanical illustrations. One of these is extinct. He named it, it's called Du Priest, probably named after a mountain there in Nelson County, the Priest Mountain. Southerners chose their apples for flavor, but also for uses. They dried apples on metal roofs and on slats of tin in the backyard. This is actually a photograph from Kentucky. They loaded apples into wooden casks and put them on wagons and took them with ox and horses to markets like Nashville and Greenville, South Carolina. When railroads came, they put those wagons onto railroad cars and shipped the apples to Chicago and New York. Apples went on barges down the Ohio and Mississippi River to New Orleans. They traveled all over the South. Apples were grown commercially as an off-farm product in every state in the South. I'm thinking of something you dig into archives and you never know what you're going to find. And I found a jewel in the Wilson Library over at UNC. I was looking at the papers of a Raleigh banker and cotton manufacturer and lawyer named Robert Leake Steele. There's a Steele building on the UNC campus named for him. And he had a farm in Chatham County with 33 different varieties of apples. And so here's this lawyer, this businessman, and he has a farm journal, and he has this list. And it reminds me, I know this is hard to read, but I'll read it to you. It reminds me of J.C. Ralston's Lust list. You know, his list of plants. I have one on my computer that says, must have plants. It's 5 pages, single-spaced. So I know you can identify with this, but here's Walter Leake Steele. He's not really a farmer. He's just doing this on the side. He already has 33 different kinds of apples. And he says, he has, I want the following. And he lists 14 apples and 15 pears. And I know, I just immediately felt kinship with Robert Leake Steele there in the Wilson Library because I knew we had a similar passion. So I've talked a bit about presidential apple clubs, swapping apples, and farmers having their favorites, and even part-time farmers having their lust lists. This Arboretum is very connected to the nursery industry. And I want to talk a bit about Southern nurseries. One that really intrigued me that I really knew nothing about until I started researching this book is Pomaria Nursery outside of Columbia, South Carolina, in a little town called Pomaria. There was a railroad depot there, and they shipped apples all over the East. Tennessee, Kentucky, up into New England. It was a really interesting nursery to me because, well, it was one of the first that really was professional. But they gathered so many local apples that there was a grower in Edisto, South Carolina. And Edisto, we're talking sand hills. I mean, that's the coastal plain. And this gentleman contributed 6 different apples. 6 of his apples show up in these catalogs year after year after year. They introduced the Hoover apple, which became widely grown in the South, kind of an oddly spotted apple. Ferdinand was named for this gentleman's neighbor. And you just really get a sense of this community of farmers in a state that we don't even associate with apples, were passionate about this fruit and put their stamp on it, put their name on it, named it for place name or neighbor. The real giant among nurseries in the South, of course, is Fruitlands outside of Augusta, Georgia. Jules Alphonse Prosper Berkmans and his father immigrated from Belgium and founded this nursery in the mid-1800s. They were prominent horticulturalists and scientists. The father was a physician. Prosper, as a teenager, had contributed to major horticultural works in Europe. And they immigrated to Georgia. The South at that time is a lot more diverse than we think of it. There was actually a Belgian community in Rome, Georgia, and that's what attracted them to the state. But they settled here with great plans to blanket the South with fruit trees, especially apples. They occupied this house that was built by the former owner of this farm, this property, who was an editor of an agricultural journal, Dennis Redmond, and he built this house. It's a concrete house. It was unique for its time. It had very deep verandas, thick walls, and it had an apple storage area in the basement. This house was built with the labor of enslaved people. And at this time, people outside the South didn't recognize Southern apples. So Downing's 1845 edition of Fruits and Fruit Trees of America listed one Southern apple, Father Abraham. And even Patrick Barry's book, a few years later in 1851, the fruit garden had 133 apples and 4 Southern apples. So right at this time, 3 years later, Alphonse and his father Louis opened this nursery, and their first catalog has 900 trees, 900 different apple varieties listed, many of them Southern. And he touts these apples as being chosen and acclimated for the South. Berkman's really put apples on the map, on the Southern map. And just a little, does anybody know what this building is now? This is the home of the Augusta National Golf Course. This is the Senate, that's much altered. This is the clubhouse of the Augusta National Golf Course, and there's not an apple tree in sight. So I wanted to talk to you about Prosper Berkmans because he reminds me so much of JC. I found in the University of Georgia Hargrett Library, their archives, I found his journals. They're about this big, and I can see him carrying these in his pocket as he walked through the nursery. He wrote in this beautiful hand, this beautiful old-fashioned hand, evocative descriptions of the apples. He noticed the world just like you do. The reason you're here at the Arboretum is you care about the world around you. You notice the world and pay attention to it. You want to bring beauty into your life. And Prosper Berkmans was just like that. And he drew these just charming pictures of apples. And this is a classic way of depicting an apple. It really shows you the shape, tells you a lot of identifying characteristics when you slice an apple this way and draw it. And it just, his notebooks are meticulous. I want to tell you one more story before we wrap up and go to a panel. And that's a story another one that was largely new to me, and one that I think is under-recognized and underreported. And that's the role of Indigenous people in the South in cultivating apples. So I think I've neglected to mention that apples are not native to North America. The Malus domestica that we think of as an apple is not native. We're not sure exactly how it arrived. There's several different ways it could have. It could have come in the 1500s from Florida, as peaches and citrus did, and traveled up into the South. Also could have come down the spine of the Appalachians from the Northeast. We know that cod fishermen from Europe deposited apple seeds on the islands off the coast of Maine, and that's how apples arrived at that part of North America. There are several native crab apples, but apples arrived in a variety of ways. The first planted garden I mentioned was in Jamestown. But when apples did arrive, the indigenous people in North America were already cultivators of the soil. They cultivated mulberry trees by removing competition and harvesting in a certain way. They were primed to receive apple seeds. And when fur trappers, French and English fur trappers, traveled into the Blue Ridge Mountains, they found apple trees already growing in Cherokee orchards. The Cherokee people in Georgia, I'm going to focus on Georgia because we know a lot about Georgia because of a very tragic chapter in American history. The Indian Removal Act was passed in 1836, which decreed that the remaining populations of indigenous people in the East would be relocated or driven from their homes. And in Georgia, this is often referred to as the Trail of Tears. Georgia had the largest indigenous population at the time of the Indian Removal Act, and their forced removal was especially violent and very quick. The reason we know so much about what the Cherokee people owned, one reason we know so much about what they owned, what their farms were like, how they lived, is that after they left, just a few months after they left, federal valuators came in to meticulously record their possessions, their looms, their kitchen equipment, their barns, their stills, where they distilled apple brandy and peach brandy, their horses, their mules, and their orchards. We know, because this was all recorded so it could be given to white male Georgians, we know that the small Cherokee orchards, that over half the households had mature orchards. And these were orchards grown with trees grown on their own roots. David and Anne Marie and I grow trees on varying degrees of dwarfing rootstock. Well, that wasn't common in that time in our country. So these were trees. These were big trees. So 30 or 40 trees on a small farm. We're talking about trees that are 30 feet tall. Major Ridge's orchard had 1,000 peach trees and 500 apple trees. So, and here's where the Cherokee apple story gets a little messy. After Indian removal, for the next 2 or 3 years, a white nurseryman from Clarksville, Georgia, named Jarvis Van Buren, traveled on horseback into Cherokee territory, and he gathered apples and grafting wood. And he brought those back to his nursery called Gloaming Nursery, and he introduced those apples into the nursery trade. And he named them. Sometimes he conferred his own name. He found a lake-keeping apple, and he called it Mountain Belle. And sometimes he used Cherokee place names like Culasaga or Kitagiski. In less than 30 years, these Cherokee apples were written about in national pomological journals as being the premier apples of the South. Many of them are late-season, long-keeping apples. And we have those apples today. We can taste them. We know what they are, but we don't know why they are. We don't know what were the desires of the Cherokee people who chose them. We don't know the original names. We don't know how they were used as sustenance or culturally. And that's just a hole in history. And as I researched this book, I wanted to find those jewels in the archives, like Prosper Berkman's journals and the beautiful old nursery catalogs with hundreds of apple names. I wanted to find those and look hard at those. But I also wanted to look hard at the holes in history. I believe silence speaks. And I encourage you to look at your garden out here and look at the history and the archives and know what came with the plants that you enjoy, but also pay attention to what you don't know about them. This is Kitagiski, which is a Cherokee apple, and it was grown commercially throughout the South. It was actually grown commercially in France until World War II. So these Cherokee apples travel far and wide, even though we don't know their whole story. I had thought about talking to you. I've talked to you about Wild and Tamed, but I'm not going to talk to you about Lost and Revised. You'll have to read the book. But before we go to the panel, I want to read something about my own journey, because this book also includes a little bit about my own journey as the South's first cider maker. I'd like to say the first legal cider maker in the 20th century. And each chapter begins with a short personal story about the arc of my own journey of planting a cider apple orchard and making cider. And in this particular passage, I'm trying to figure out what to name my cidery. And I'm sitting on our patio, Chuck's in my patio, and I'm looking at the hayfield that was just mown, and the hay is, coiled in those beautiful raked rows before it gets rolled. And my grandmother used to say, that girl frets over things like a dog worries a bone. That night on the porch, I worried like a dog with a bone. The wrong name might mix my crazy plan to grow cider apples and make an orchard-centric cider, something no one was doing at the time. An off-kilter name might mean my dream was flawed. Though every part of me knew it was wrong-headed, I felt the name for my cider venture had to fit like a well-worn glove. I sat, I breathed in the smell of freshly cut hay, and I listened to the birds in the black gum tree. On about my third breath, I felt a presence behind me, as if someone was standing right behind me, watching me. I slowly turned my head, and I saw a large gray fox trotting calmly across the stone patio a few feet behind my chair. Not 10 feet away, he raised a leg and peed on a planter full of pink chrysanthemums. Now, those were Ryan's pink, but I left that out because I knew my editor would say that was TMI. Then he sat on his haunches at the top of the steps leading to the pasture. I could see the brilliant red ruff circling his neck and his red cheeks. A black stripe ran down his back to the tip of his tail. Gray Fox stared at the newly mowed pasture. I watched him breathe while I didn't. We sat together as the birds settled in the black gum and hay dried in the field. His tongue lolled over his black lips as he scanned the pasture for field mice. Then I must have moved or drawn too deep of a breath. Gray Fox bounded off the porch in one great leap. He touched the grass once, then flew across the lawn, barely skimming the ground, his brilliant tail straight behind him. The sun set and the air turned cold. I gathered my notes and whispered a word of thanks for the fox and for an evening of few calm breaths overlooking my orchard. That night, the temperature dropped and the wind died. At 6:30 the next morning, fog rolled up from Rockhouse Creek in pale gray clouds. It wove low through the orchard and spilled into the rows of hay like a silver waterfall. I stood on the spot where my wild neighbor visited me. I had it. Foggy Ridge cider. The perfect name for my place in the world and my wild, crazy dream. So I turned 70 this year. And I believe we're never done. We're never done learning. We're never done creating. We're never done being better neighbors and friends and partners. And I know you are never done here in this creative community. So we're going to enlarge the conversation now with David and Anne Marie and turn the lights up and have a little bit of back and forth up here.
All righty. So if David and Anne Marie can come up, I've got microphones for you both that we would like to affix to your people so that we can hear everybody. But while we are doing that, I did have a question prepared for you that I would love for you to discuss. So your book does talk about a revitalization, going back and rediscovering all these apples that we lost and kind of preserving and bringing them back. Do you think that it's possible for another rediversification event, not just revitalization, but another event where we diversify apple populations like they did back in the day when they were taming it. Is that possible? What do you think that might look like?
So a couple of things. Apples are diversifying now through the breeding efforts of universities. So Cosmic Crisp is a top example. It's from Washington State. They're hoping to make another. What did
Cosmic Crisp?
Yeah. It has the largest, I think it's a $10 million ad campaign. It's the largest ad campaign since Florida orange juice. So we see a lot of modern varieties that are kind of focus group bred, and they're what are called club apples. So I think there are only 28 growers who are allowed to grow Cosmic Crisp in Washington. And then New York State, a couple of years after Cosmic Crisp Cornell introduced their version. So we see a lot of modern varieties. Most grocery stores feel like they can't sell more than about 6 or 7 apple varieties. So you almost have to have one fall off before another one comes in. But I'd see another thing that might be interested. The researchers at Cornell and at the R station, the Agricultural Research Station in West Virginia, are using Malus angustifolia, which is the southern crab apple, the one that was native to the South. They're using the genetic material from that tree to breed apples that will be resistant to fire blight, which is the bacterial infection, which has become much more common in a warming climate. And just one final thing, and then I'll just shut my mouth up. The preservation orchards you mentioned, like Horn Creek in North Carolina, the Georgia Heritage Orchard, there's one in Kentucky. These are orchards that preserve these apple varieties, but they do more than that. They educate, they have grafting workshops, they give scion wood away to home gardeners, and they also work with commercial growers. I especially see this in Georgia, to help them uncover older varieties that may have market uses for today in commercial production.
That's awesome. Okie dokie. So we've got new people up here. Let's get them to introduce themselves. Anne-Marie, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself for everybody here?
Sure. I'm Anne-Marie Thornton. My husband David and I, who's in the back, own James Creek Orchards and James Creek Cider House. We're maybe 50 minutes from here, down in Cameron in the Sandhills. We've been growing apples for about 15 years. You know, sometimes you get very busy with the day-to-day, and I was standing back there and I thought it was probably 15 years ago this very month that we called David Vernon and placed our first order of Southern heirloom apples. We've been making hard cider for about 7 years.
Awesome. And David?
I'm David Vernon. I'm from Caswell County, but I have a Reedsville address. It's strange. But basically, I'm a teacher. I spent 30 years in the public school system teaching AP Physics and AP Chemistry. Retired from that. I now teach part-time at a Christian school in Burlington. Part-time, several days a week, but not the entire day. But I turned a hobby of growing apple trees from my family farm into a small business with the help of Lee Calhoun, and several others, primarily Lee Calhoun. And we've been able to propagate trees and spread them throughout the United States. And we do sell some apples, not many because it's very labor intensive and I've only got 2 hands. And it didn't fit in well with teaching. So I had to figure out what would work with teaching and what would work with farming. And so we've been able to do that. And a lot of the varieties that Diane has mentioned, we propagate and educate people about those. So besides just selling a tree, you rarely just have an apple tree sale. You usually have someone calling and wanting information. And we go down all sorts of paths that Diane's mentioned as well, whether it's history or whether it's the propagation of trees or how they work and how they pollinate. So it's an educational opportunity for people and also a chance to plant history.
Sure. Now, David, I heard that when people call you up and they ask you for certain apple varieties, you can pretty well guess where in the country they're calling from.
Okay,
Could you tell us a little bit about that?
There are lots of apple varieties, and I speak to a lot of people, a lot of times on the phone, sometimes by email, but a lot on the phone as well. And of course, My accent's kind of hard to get away from. But when you speak to people throughout the entire South, you get a lot of different accents, especially from those who are native to the area. And so sometimes I'll hear an accent and I'm thinking that's Eastern Kentucky, or that's Western North Carolina, or that's northeast of Raleigh. And a lot of times I'll be able to figure out where they're from by what they ask. Maybe not their accent, but they'll ask, they're looking for a Benham apple. And I'm thinking, well, you've got to be on the border between Kentucky and Virginia. Or they'll say, I'm looking for a Tony apple. So maybe only once every 3 years someone asks for a Tony apple tree. And I'm thinking, well, you're from Union County, Cabarrus County, Stanley County area. And I did have someone this year ask for the same apple. And I was like, you're from Cabarrus County? He said, no, but my family's from there. So, but there are lots. There's the Taylor Sweet from the mountains. There's the Jimbo from the mountains near Avery County. If someone calls for Virginia Beauty, it's usually along the foothills or the Blue Ridge stretching from around Charlottesville into northern North Carolina. The Hunch from southeastern North Carolina, the Mattamuskeet from around Mattamuskeet Lake, just a few others, just one more maybe. And if anyone mentions a limber twig, I would say half the time it's because they have are not too far from Henry Morton's nursery in eastern Tennessee. And there are lots of limber twigs. And so that's, yeah, you can pretty much, not always, but you can pretty much pinpoint where they're from or where their roots are by what they ask for, the apple trees.
Nice. Diane mentioned that you have a family apple called the Mary Reed. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
So I happen to have it right here.
What do you know?
Yeah. Just popped out of nowhere. Essentially, we grew up, as Diane probably has mentioned several times, we just had apples around us. And we didn't have apple orchards for selling in Caswell County. We didn't raise commercial orchards. But everybody had apple trees in the backyard for home use, either picking and eating during the year or cooking, especially and drying. We didn't do much cider except unless it was just for fun. And my aunt had a Mary Reed apple tree. And as a 5 or 6 or 7-year-old, it's like, oh, that's the Mary Reed apple. You didn't think anything about it. She would have them in buckets on her back porch after she picked them up off the ground, because her grandmother taught her when she was young, you never picked an apple off the tree. You only got it when it hit the ground. Now, I think she did that because she was afraid a child would pick an apple that she might use. But definitely if it hit the ground, it must have been ripe. So my aunt always had a bucket of these apples in the back porch, and she would she cooked with them. They were tart apples. They tasted pretty good for a child, especially. And then especially if it ever, when it snowed in the wintertime and we were out of school, she would always take the apples that she had dried, and we had fried apple pies. So no matter what, they were fried apple pies, little half-moon things that make the ones at McDonald's look like not good. but no matter how deep the snow was, I was going to trudge the half a mile down the road to eat some of her apples. But yeah, this is the Mary Reed apple. It's and it's very versatile. I've since known that it grows anywhere from, you can grow it successfully from Iowa all the way down to the southern part of Alabama. It's very disease resistant. It's never going to make grocery stores because I happen to have brought one of the nicer samples. A lot of times they're irregularly shaped, lopsided, some big, some small. So it really is a home orchard apple, but it's very disease resistant. And as Diane mentioned, it was one that our family kept alive for those very characteristics.
Nice. Speaking of home orchard apples, do you have any recommendations of apple varieties that are better suited for the home orchard rather than commercial production?
Yeah, but we don't have time.
Is that right?
Yeah, because a lot of times when people ask that, I have to find out like what they want to do with the apple. Are they looking for fresh eating apples?
Right.
Do they want apples in July? Do they want them in October? Do they want them in August? Do you cook with the apples? Some people do, some people don't. Do you want to make cider with the apples? Where do they live?
Right.
Because as Diane mentioned, there is a dramatic climate difference between where she lives, where I live, and from where I live to where Raleigh is. So you would not plant certain types of apples around Raleigh that might grow where I'm at, but there are lots of apples that will grow around Raleigh. So yeah, I do answer those questions, but it's not something you can put. I had people try to like change my website, and they're like, you need some sort of like button you can push and you put your zip code in and what you want. And I'm like, that really, it isn't quite that simple. So that's where a lot of the emails that people send to me and a lot of the phone calls come from, is that they are trying to assess what to get.
Yeah. And
then I have to lead down the educational process of what works where they're at. I'm always happy when someone calls from where Diane lives. I'm like, just pick anything. It's going to work there.
That's excellent. Well, thank you. Let's talk to Anne Marie a little bit about your cidery. Could you tell us a little bit about where your cidery is, where you got started from, where you sell from, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, but our cidery is in Cameron, so we're down in the Sandhills, and a lot of people joke that sounds like peach growing country. But as Diane's talk attests, apples grow all over the South, and they do just fine in the Sandhills. We grow mainly old Southern apple varieties, mainly trees that we got from David. We grow Grimes Golden and King David, and then we use these in the cider. As David notes, sometimes apples are kind of spotty. Spotty apples are just fine for cider. The good-looking ones usually come with me to the Carborough Farmers Market. And I guess this is my 10th season at the Carborough Farmers Market. Sometimes it feels like the apple of the week because we grow sometimes just a little bit of so many things. But that has been a really wonderful experience at the farmers market, and having people taste apples and tears come to their eyes because it reminds them of their childhood, their grandfather's apple trees, and that's just been a very interesting experience. We have had the same thing happen with cider. I think on our very first day pouring cider at the Carborough Farmers Market, a woman tried the cider and did kind of start welling up with tears and said something in French. And I said, did she just say just like grandma's? That's amazing. So we do have a lot of fun with the cider, exploring flavors using our old Southern apples.
That is absolutely beautiful. And you were gracious enough to bring cider from your cidery to pour for us to taste. Could you tell us a little bit about that variety of cider that you brought?
Sure. We've got two from our James Creek Cider House line. We do James Creek Cider House, which is mainly the apples that we grow. And sometimes we call the Etude series, where we're doing experiments, and sometimes with apples from other folks. So for the James Creek, we have our Summer Gold. It's from our 2022 harvest. Typically, we release a cider as we start to harvest those very same apples the next year. So Summer Gold, it has a lot of yellow apples in it. It has Hughes Crab that's over on the table, some Grimes Golden that dates back to Johnny Appleseed times, King David. My husband David loves to plant King David apple, and it is wonderful for cider. And some Magnum Bonums and kind of bits and bobs of other things that maybe didn't make it to the market. The cider is a little bit on the sweet side. It just has a hint of sweetness to it.
Nice.
The other cider is a little different for us. It's a single varietal, and often we believe in blending, but sometimes it's fun to just focus on one apple and see what it offers and see what it brings. And so that's a Harrison apple, which was grown across the South, but is probably really known as a New Jersey apple. Sometimes I make the joke that back in Revolutionary days, when Newark was the Napa of the cider world, then Harrison was the apple of Newark. And so that's been a really fun apple to work with. That cider is bone dry, it's naturally sparkling, and the flavor is very nice. It has kind of a hint of sort of tangerine, which turns out is actually typical for the Harrison apple. If you encounter a Harrison cider, it probably have a little tangerine or mandarin hint.
No kidding. Well, Diane has informed me that you are wonderfully adept at describing the flavors of apples, and the way you just described that one with tangerine, I love that. Could you maybe give us another taste of your ability to describe flavor?
Okay. Among our other ciders, or among my favorite apples, are russeted apples. We talk, how do you make cider?
Tell them what russet is.
Oh, russet. So it looks maybe like a Bosc pear. And it's kind of mustard in color. If you go to the grocery store, you get red and you get yellow, maybe you get green apples. But there are all kinds of apples that have rough skins, and some almost look like a potato, like a keener seedling. It's really rough. Diane had asked, would I mention, how do we make cider? Because some people think it's like beer making when it's really much more wine making, where you crush up the fruit. That's the tricky part with apples. No foot stomping whatsoever. So you crush up the apples, capture the juice, then we typically pitch yeast and let it ferment. And then we do lots of blending ourselves. And with wine, everyone talks about tannins. Tannins are in the skins of the grapes. Well, tannins are really in the skins of the apples as well. And so these russeted apples, which have particularly thick skins, really have beautiful tannins and lend wonderful characteristics to cider.
That's great. Well, I am very excited about trying some apples, but before we get into that, I did want to give Diane one more question. Okay. Diane, in your book, you kind of, if you read between the lines, you kind of get the impression that you don't have the highest opinion of Cosmic Crisp and Honey Crisp. I believe you refer to them as violently crispy or something to that, something to that effect. So I'm curious, like, what your ideal apple would be, like the direction of what the quintessential. Because I love Honeycrisp. It's a beautiful apple, but if you, I'd love to hear. Yeah,
Honeycrisp is a game changer, and it has to do with the way the cell walls are constructed. And an apple, apples are 25% air, and that's why you can bob for apples in the fall. They float. So when you bite into an apple, your teeth break the cell walls, and the juice kind of, it's like it's propelled into your mouth. It's full of ester, sugar, acid. Apples have a surprising amount of acid that's often masked by the sugar, and some tannins. And so apples are kind of engineered to capture mammals to then, eat the apple and go distribute the seeds, genetically, out in the world. And that's one reason apples grow all over the world. I mean, from Canada down to now the tropics, with some techniques there. But Honeycrisp, and I can't remember the exact breeding on that. I don't know if they bred it for this, if they just discovered this and then amplified it through selection. But the cell walls have this, it's called breaking. They break in a way that really floods your mouth with juice. And that's like, it's like ruined everybody for anything else. It's like, now that's all everybody wants. And I think you've probably gathered, and I think you share this trait as you're interested in lots of things. In this room, more is more. I know the J.C. Ralston crowd. You want one of everything at least. And you're already eyeing those plants over there saying, where can I put it in my overcrowded garden? And I just think it's important to explore lots of different flavors. And people ask me my favorite apple, and I just refuse to answer that question.
That's fair.
But I just would encourage all of you to try different apples and, go to the Carver Farmers Market. I mean, how many apple varieties do y'all grow?
I think we've lost count, which is a little bit silly, but probably about 100.
Yeah. So there's a lot to try out there, yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, well, I think we are all just dying to get at some apples, so let's give all of our guests a big old round of applause.